Well, hello to the Hope group of week 4. Thanks for some great interaction with each other. Um, some really good questions as well. I'm especially drawn to the way various members of your group are sort of trying to hold the strands of Romans together as the letter develops. It's so easy to kind of give up on that because there's so much happening at once. It's a big letter, lots of kind of big ideas of our faith. And, it's easy to kind of get lost in one section of it and to lose sight of how it relates to what's come before. But if we can keep those threads kind of alive in our mind, then we are able, I think, to interpret what Paul is saying better, because we can see what he's saying as a development rather than just a bunch of scattered ideas. So great job on that. I just wanted to give a few moments here to you to respond to some of the observations that you made that are really good, some things I want to highlight in your reactions, a few questions that were asked that I want to try to address. So there are some relationships among the different contributions to the discussion. So I might hold several of the posts together here and how I engage them. But starting with Naran, you asked some really great, concise questions, Naran, there at the beginning. First of all, just what to understand justification to me. And it's, of course, not a concept to be oversimplified, but I think it's worth giving a kind of provisional sense of what it is. I think broadly in Paul's letters, it is a term that is introduced especially in contexts of inheritance, and that is important. Inheritance from God, inheritance from one generation to the next, inheritance of generations far down the line from ancient ancestors. Justification often comes into Paul's teaching in that kind of a context. And so I think that helps us maybe clarify what it's getting at. I think to summarize how Paul uses the term in those contexts, it names the way that God brings a person, a community, into a life-giving relationship of covenant. I say life-giving, and I'm making this motion, I guess, subconsciously, because we often think of relationship in the Bible or relationship with God in very abstract terms, in terms of like the status of a person before God. And I'm not sure that we ever know what we're talking about when we talk like that. By relationship, I mean one of giving and receiving that actually is manifest in the conditions of a person or a community's life. So it's dynamic. It is not just abstract, it is concrete, and it is expressed in a whole variety of dimensions of the life of the justified, you might say. So in Abraham's case, justification is not just him acquiring a status with God, it's being brought into a giving and receiving with God that affects the movements of Abraham's body, the land that he lives on, the future of provision of that land for him and his descendants. There's a whole kind of complex of covenantal dynamics that involve land, animals, human beings in relationship to one another that are all involved in the way that God relates to people, and that are involved, therefore, in the way God justifies people, brings them into a promised inheritance. So Paul is talking in Romans 4 about the justification of Abraham, because he's not just an isolated individual or a paradigm or a model or an exemplar. he can be those things in a certain sense, but he is fundamentally, as Paul introduces him, a father, a forefather, an ancestor, so that the way he was justified, the way that he came into and enjoyed life-giving, if also incomplete in a sense, relationship with the God who was the creator, was a dynamic of covenant that then operated throughout the family of promise that descended from him. So that justification names how others who come after Abraham inherit what was promised to Abraham and his future. And what they inherit is not just a status, it's a certain context, quality, character of life, and not always positive, by the way. As we see in this section from Paul, it involves suffering, it involves failure. It's not an ideal, but it is a key way in which God is made known, present, active in the world, and enacting God's justice in the world by justifying the human partner, community, and person. So that's broadly how I understand justification. And I think it was Luke who asked later on how to understand this term as part of a sequence that Paul seems to use. And I thought that was a great question to kind of connect to this, because he sort of asks, is this order significant? What does it mean? That faith seems to sort of come into play, and with it justification, but then with it reconciliation, and then salvation. But salvation often given a future horizon, at least in chapter 5. And I think some healthy reluctance on your part, Luke, to simply embrace what Keck to some degree, Witherington, I think also imagine is a primarily future sense of saved, and therefore future sense of everything that Paul's talking about in Romans 5. And I just don't think that's quite right either. But is there a significance to this order? Yes. I think that you can see how God is faithful to what God has created, in what God initiates with Abraham. And the faithfulness of God is what inspires Abraham's faith. The faith of God is what bears as its fruit the faith of Abraham in God, especially as the one who makes promises that are the shape of Abraham's hope and future across generations. So justification is what comes by faith, the faith of Abraham, but not the faith of Abraham that sort of just comes out of nowhere. It's the faith of Abraham that's the fruit of the faith of God. And then reconciliation is what then unfolds, you might say, as the outworking of that justifying work of God. And that reconciliation comes to a kind of fullness, according to Paul in Romans 4 and 5, in the death of Jesus, because of the way that that death breaks the hold, the enslaving power of sin over the human, and frees the human to embody what God has created the human to be as part of God's creation. And so in this context, Paul associates reconciliation, especially with the powerful death of Jesus, and salvation with the life of Jesus. And in a sense, situates us in between those. You know, we have been reconciled, but we will be saved. And I don't think he means to present salvation as something that is entirely future in this context, but instead to talk about how there is a future outworking of this justifying work of God that finally involves being fully conformed to Jesus as risen from among the dead. And that's the way that he's using salvation in this context. It is liberation, especially as it reaches its fullness and how it's expressed in the human on the earth, again, as both community and as person. So in other contexts, Paul will talk about salvation in a past sense. And I think here he is holding tightly together the shape of Abraham's life of hope, and then its fullness in Christ, with the shape of Jesus's life of death that leads to life. And that's the sort of narrative context in which he is presenting this sequence of terms that culminates in salvation. So there is a sense in which salvation does remain future for the human, but I think it would be a mistake to reduce the meaning of salvation throughout Paul to that, or to regard what he's talking about in chapter 5 as entirely future. There, of course, he says that the Spirit of God has been poured into our hearts, that's the Spirit of holiness by which Jesus was raised from among the dead. So that's the power of the resurrection that's already at work in us. That's saving power. It's not entirely future. It's already transforming us. 1 Corinthians, Paul will actually talk about people in the midst of being saved as an ongoing present activity. So I hope that's helpful to you, Luke. And maybe I could just comment, since I'm on what you said, because I've already alluded to it. You are right, I think, to question, when we're talking about Abraham's faith, are we talking exclusively about his faith, or are we also talking about the faith of God? Clearly, I would say in Romans 4, Abraham's faith is significant. It's not to be minimized, but this has come in the context of the faith of God that's been expressed. You might remember 3:3, will the faithlessness or unfaithfulness of some nullify the faith of God? May it never be. And so Paul's been giving an account of the faith of God that is the power, the source of the faith of the human. And now, of course, he's reaching way back to Abraham to identify sort of how that family of promise, that family of covenant, was begun in a way that reflects the faith of God, bearing as its fruit the faith of the human, specifically in Abraham as the father of the people of God, and finally the father of many peoples. So I think that it's key to see that the reason Abraham trusts God is that God is trustworthy. The basis of Abraham's faith is the faithfulness, or the faith of God. And if we take those apart from each other, then, as several of you have commented, we'll end up with faith as a kind of, work that is something people can boast in, associated with a questionable kind of authority and judgment. And it ceases to be a gift that comes from God as the fruit of God's own faith that is then manifest in the human, which is how I think Paul presents it in both chapters 3 and 4. And then, of course, as the gift of the Spirit that comes with it in chapter 5. Nuran also asks why Paul talks about flesh. And that was just a great question, Nuran. I love how you're zeroing in on some things here. Because I think that flesh, as you are right to pick up on, is not just about, what we in our context might think of as biological relationship or procreative relationship or that kind of thing. I think that's a certain kind of modern obsession that has infiltrated our interpretation of Romans in a way that's not justified really by any evidence in the letter or the context of the letter when it was written. So, as you probably can remember, the context in which Paul has been talking about flesh in Romans is specifically circumcision. And that's the way he develops it here in chapter 4, so that to be children of Abraham according to the flesh would be children of Abraham by being circumcised, and all of the practices that circumcision symbolizes in this context, works of the law. And so the significance of flesh in this context, I think, is not a genetic thing, but it is something that is visible in the body. A way of marking the body, a way of interpreting what is visible about the body, especially something that you might say sets a body or a community of bodies apart from others and is thereby vulnerable to becoming a basis for the wrong kind of human authority that is hypocritical. And that's not what circumcision was for when God gave that covenant of circumcision to Abraham in Genesis 17. But it is something that the non-Jewish readers apparently need to be reminded of, that this is not what the law is for. It's not for prescribing works of obedience that can then be sort of burnished as credentials of authority to rule over one another or others. And Paul gives us an account here of how circumcision is a sign of a dynamic of relationship that is fundamentally about faith, which he unpacks as not what Abraham had primarily, but you might say Abraham's trust when he had nothing, when he didn't have anything to offer, when he was basically dead in terms of his ability to engender a future with his wife. And that's what faith is when the body is not a source of impressive appearances, not something that can be interpreted as sort of fitting some definition of ruling power, but is instead unimpressive, apparently hollow of life. And that is where faith as the gift of God, you might say, is the most powerful, transformative, creative, future-making. So hopefully that's helpful about flesh. Flesh is a way of understanding the body in its visibility as well as vulnerability, and a way of thinking about how the body is presented in relationships of power that is susceptible to the wrong kind of power or authority based upon what the body supposedly represents in this context, especially with respect to God's law and obeying it. Last question you ask, and it's striking to me that you're not the only one to ask this week. In other groups, this same question has come up. So I'm kind of thinking about what has given rise to this. But why did Jesus have to die, you asked, Naran, at the end? And this is a question that I think can tempt us to give a theologically problematic answer, but does have, I think, theologically sound ways of being addressed as well. And I'll try to explain what I mean here. The theologically problematic way of making sense of Jesus's death is to place it within a context of necessity, or you might say the resolution of a broken system, so that Jesus's death becomes a calculated solution to a problem with a system that can be generally described. And I think the reason that's theologically problematic is that it sort of insinuates that God, as the creator of the world, somehow becomes subject to the laws of a system that is separate from God, so that God is finally under pressure to solve the problem that this system has developed. And if that's what we find ourselves doing to answer the question why Jesus had to die, then I think we're attributing something to God that we can't. And in that sense, I think I would want to say Jesus did not have to die. There's nothing in a way of sort of calculating the system of the world or the trajectory of the world that can render the death of Jesus as a necessity. In that sense, God is free to do whatever God will do. God did not have to create. When God does create, God doesn't have to do this or that with what God creates, because God is God. But of course, God is not just a naked sovereign power either. And this is where I think there are theologically sound ways of trying to answer your question. Because by virtue of what God has made, whom God has made, and how God has been revealed through what God has made, we can say some things about God. God has made God's self known in a sense. And so that allows us to talk about the way things have to be, you might say, as constrained by God's own character. So, for example, something we've already been talking about is God's faithfulness. So that based upon how God has been revealed, you might say God has to keep God's promises, not because God's promises exert a sort of pressure on God from outside of God, wherever that would be or whatever that would be, but because to say God is to say the one who is faithful to God's promises. And in that sense, God's being true to God's promises is necessary because it is a way of talking about who God is. It's a character trait, you might say, of God, God's faithfulness to God's promises. And so, in that sense, I think retrospectively, when Jesus has been raised from among the dead and is born witness as risen from among the dead in the world to certain people, and this news travels. And of course, finally, Paul himself is confronted with the presence of this living Jesus. Paul develops his theology, you might say, from that kind of scandalous fact backward, as it were. So that we can say that since Jesus was raised from among the dead, something about the way that he died is the way to resurrection life. And in that sense, we can say is the necessary path of resurrection life because it's how resurrection life has come. That doesn't sort of impose some rule of a system on God. It is instead a way of saying this is how God has been revealed. And so we now make sense of life and who God is in light of how God has been revealed. And so if that's the framework within which we're understanding this question of why Jesus had to die, then I think we can say Jesus had to die to free the human from the power of sin and to empower the human to embody the fullness of life, which is finally resurrection from among the dead. And between that death and resurrection of Jesus, where we find ourselves, we're being shaped by the power of that resurrection, which is the Spirit, not as an escape from death, but through the way that we digest and navigate death ourselves, death in all of its dimensions, not just what happens to us at the end of our life, but all of the ways that creation has been subjected to decay, the way that we digest that power of decay with the power of resurrection is our participation in that power of Jesus's death and life. So Jesus didn't have to die in some kind of general a priori way, but we can see in retrospect how Jesus's death was the way that a certain enslaving power over the human and the rest of creation was broken. And the human made a body of witness to that resurrection, saving power in the world, sharing it with one another, and bearing witness to it as also the hope for all of creation. Something like that, Yaron. So thanks again. And this probably segues quite nicely into Beth's really wonderful words about hope, which is the name of the group. So this was great. And I think you just give a great account there, Beth, about how hope, Luke's reaction here was good too, is not just this kind of fleeting thing that we throw against difficult situations, but kind of orientation of a life that we learn to develop over the course of our lives, not the least of which is through difficulty, but not only through difficulty, through memory, through the practices of the community that we find ourselves in as Christians, through all kinds of ways that God shapes us with hope. You point to the parallel here between Abraham and Jesus, and I thought that was great. I hope you picked up on how Paul draws that out in the last few verses of chapter 4, where the same deathly existence of Abraham and Sarah with sort of the deadness of their life facing a future of promise that seems impossible to embody, that's parallel to the death of Jesus, which was of a kind that seemed to promise no future whatsoever. And yet, in the same way that uh, the life of promise was drawn from the deathly old Abraham and Sarah, the life of resurrection was drawn from the crucified body of Jesus. That's the shape of hope. And our Christian life is about learning that pattern of death and life as our own. We're baptized into it, as Paul's going to teach us in chapter 6. And that baptism is a kind of shape into which we grow across the whole of our lives, um, through death to resurrection. You asked at the end of your post, Beth, about unbelief versus faithlessness in my translation. And all of these terms, I think, are kind of fraught. So there's no sort of finally right translation. They all have liabilities. The reason I steer away from belief or unbelief is that I have found in my sort of Christian formation and experience that it's too thin. Not that faith or faithlessness avoids this all the time, but belief and unbelief has often come to be sort of something that people do um, about ideas, uh, about doctrines. Um, it just doesn't seem to have some of the dimensions of what we find in Paul's presentation here in chapter 4, and then back in Habakkuk and some of these other contexts that have helped shape the meaning of faith in Romans. So that's why I've sort of steered clear of unbelief, because it seems to me like that's a little bit too thin. But I think what I hear you concerned about rightly is that Abraham having faith and not being faithless doesn't mean that he was an unequivocally virtuous person. And so, in a sense, we don't want to make faith too substantive, right? Because then it becomes this idealized thing that is unambiguous and leads us to deny and repress all kinds of imperfect things about people of faith, which we shouldn't do. So it's important to see that faith is manifest in people that are broken people who make mistakes. And faithlessness, as what Abraham avoids, doesn't mean he avoids mistakes, but it does mean that in the face of what seems to be an impossible future that God promises to him through his and Sarah's bodies, he doesn't settle for the appearance. He doesn't measure life according to the flesh. He's been empowered by God to be able to see what seems invisible because it's beyond what is measurable in his and Sarah's body. And that's the sense in which I think he did not weaken in faithlessness, but trusted, but had faith in the trustworthy, faithful God who could make him the father of many peoples, being an old person with an old wife whose ability to have children together seemed well beyond the pale of possibility. David, you've got some great lines in yours. I seized upon this contrast that you have, not by flesh or not according to the flesh, but through Christ. And I think that I'm bringing this one up here now because this fits so well with what the others have said and what I've been saying in response up until now. Not by flesh means that we don't enjoy what was promised to Abraham and his future by measuring up to some way of defining obedience or even defining faithfulness, but that we participate in this future that was promised to Abraham and his family that now includes us, by being clung to by God and ourselves clinging to God even when we have nothing to go on, even when we have the kind of emptiness or difficulty that Abraham had, that Jesus had to go on. And that, I think, as Tim begins to suggest, is not just something that sort of is manifest in how we relate to God. It's manifest in how we relate to others. It's precisely our ability to trust God to provide the way that Abraham trusted God to provide that makes us hospitable people. That makes us able to take risks that are not easy to take. That enable us to look upon a situation that seems, not very promising in terms of how people are relating to one another, and to try to invest a spirit of welcome precisely there where things don't look good. So I think that's the helpful contrast between according to the flesh and Christ as the embodiment of the faith of God and the faith of the human in one person whose life is then given as a gift to us, empowering us to share with others as God has shared with us. And maybe that's what I wanted to highlight the most, Tim, in your response, which was just a helpful, I think, meditation on hospitality. Is this is where we want to have a theological account of hospitality. For understandable reasons, the talk of how God is or who God is has gotten kind of tired in a lot of our contexts and maybe in some of our souls for understandable reasons in recent years. And, we become much more passionate and fixated on human relationships and social ethics, all of which I think is to the good. But I don't think as Christians that we should lose sight of the fact that our social lives are themselves a way of relating to God. And as we see in Paul's argument here, our hospitality is a reflection of God's hospitality with us. So we are empowered to be hospitable with others by the way that God has been hospitable with us. We wake up to ways to be hospitable to others because of how we are learning of God's hospitality with us. So that dynamic of relation between God and the human that is then manifest in relationships between human beings and among human communities is a theological kind of perspective that I don't want us to lose sight of, and is so key to Paul's argument, because Jesus is the apocalypse of God that then spills out into the life of Israel and through Israel to all the peoples of the world. Stephen, boasting. You got a great word here. I think of caution, and others have brought this up as well. And I think my podcast exposition on this could be usefully improved on this point, because I do say that, Paul's boasting in oppressions or urging people to boast in oppressions is fanatical. But I don't say enough about how that is prone to be abused, and how easily this kind of slides into a hollow triumphalism and also a kind of repression of failure and disappointment, because we're supposed to be thrilled that life sucks, or tell other people who are enduring hardship that that's what they're supposed to feel like, and that's just awful. So to avoid that real vulnerability that I think is in this teaching, I would say it's important to recognize that Paul himself is speaking from the experience of oppression of an exiled people that live as subject to foreign powers, and then himself as a follower of an enemy of the Roman Empire who was executed by a Roman authority, and consequently writes many of his letters from jail and experiences all kinds of negative consequences and difficulties in his life because he is associated with Jesus the way that he is. And we have analogous kinds of oppression that people endure today when they're associated with prophets, when they're associated with um, challenges to the status quo, to the establishment that threaten those who hold power. And so I think that boasting in oppressions is something that is sound to whatever extent that kind of fanaticism can be sound when it comes not from people of privilege who are talking about oppression from a safe distance and telling everybody they're supposed to be thrilled about it, but when it comes from people who know oppression in the flesh, know it in their own experience and memory, and from people who are in deep solidarity with those people and not talking about oppression in a cheap way. Because it's from those people that we're able to see how, without cheapening suffering, and especially the kind of suffering that is the consequence of injustice, how those people are able to tell stories of power that they gained, hope that they gained, vision that they gained through the difficulties that they have endured. I think that there are lots of cases of that. And when the people who have suffered that themselves tell those stories, I don't think it cheapens their oppression typically, but instead is able to point to how human oppression does not have the final word over people's lives or the future of people's lives, but that God is present in a way that empowers the oppressed to thrive in a sense, to grow in hope even through that oppression. And that's kind of key to Paul's process that he kind of sequences here, where he says that, you know, our oppressions produce endurance, our endurance produces hope and good character. And that is key to see that we're not just talking about people who have not grown in their character through suffering, talking cheaply about oppression, but people whose character has been shaped by what they have endured, so that they're able to encourage others in the midst of oppressive circumstances to see those not as simply obstacles to get over or around, but as evidence that they are in the right struggle, that the reason that they're meeting oppression is that they're saying the truth, that they're embodying it, and that's powerful. And that's a sense in which I think that oppression can, in fact, feed hope rather than devastate it or cheapen the suffering that it's about. And Paul talks about boasting in that, I think, not hopefully to be triumphalistic, but instead to undermine the game of boasting that he's concerned about in this section of the letter. When people boast, when they judge, when they try to rule sort of according to what we idolize, according to impressive appearances, then we're locked in this game of who's better, of who can do a better job of hiding their sins, of who can tell a better myth of who they are, or America, or the church, or whatever it is. And it becomes a systematic kind of denial of our sin. And what Paul is encouraging is the ability to boast not in what human beings find to be admirable or something to idolize, but in the difficulties of the human that God makes life out of, so that we can see that we don't have to play this game of trying to be better. We can be honest about how life is difficult and not impressive and mundane and frustrating and depressing sometimes, and yet be able to name how God is at work through those difficulties to transform us and to make us people who share generously with one another. So again, I don't think that's going to eliminate all of the liabilities of this kind of teaching. Um, all the best teaching of the Bible in the wrong hands, in context of people without good character, will be distorted often and, you know, turned to ill purposes. I don't think we want to say from this that, uh, buck up, chin up, it's all going to be fine in the end. God makes everything turn out for good. That's not the kind of boasting Paul's talking about. Um, he's talking about uh, people who are able to sing songs of hope, psalms of lament, um, to band together, to cry together, to ache together, and to fight together for a better future with how they serve each other in the midst of great difficulty and oppression. And I think all of us, if we're truthful, have to name the countless ways that we stand on the shoulders of that kind of faith in our past that has brought the memory and the hope of being the people of God to us and shared it with us so that we're now bearers of that same hope ourselves. Hope that's helpful, Stephen. But I appreciate you calling attention to what I think is a real vulnerability in this text and my teaching of it too. Thanks again to all of you for really great contributions to the discussion in week 4, and I'm looking forward to what's coming up in week 5.